They told you it was fiction. A story, a myth, a clever invention of Gothic horror and occult fantasy. But that was the first lie. What if the Necronomicon was never imagined, but remembered? What if its verses didn't come from the minds of authors, but from fractures in the veil that separates awareness from the abyss? You see, myths are not created, they're decoded. Every civilization dreams of monsters, of ancient gods and forbidden books, not because they share imagination, but because they share memory. The same memory buried in your blood. Humming just beneath language, pressing against the back of your thoughts when the world gets too quiet. The Necronomicon is not a book. It is a mirror. A parasite. A key. A whisper coiled in the mind of anyone curious enough to ask the wrong questions. It doesn't wait on dusty shelves. It waits in dreams. In forgotten dialects. In strange numbers that recur too often to be random. It's not a manuscript. It's a pattern, a transmission older than ink, older than thought, carried through time not by text, but by recognition. When you hear its name, something inside you stills. Not from fear, from familiarity. Because this is not your first encounter. Only the first you've remembered. They say it was written by the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazard. But that name, like all true names, is a placeholder. What matters is not who wrote it, but who was shown. He wandered places older than civilization, not just in space, but in geometry. Babylon. The deserts of Arabia. Beneath the pyramids. Not just places on a map, but on the edge of what reality allows. When he returned, his writings did not describe travel. They described unraveling. Descent. Revelation. And it killed him, not metaphorically. Not symbolically. He was torn apart in daylight. In front of witnesses, by things that weren't there. A death written in negative space. That is the price of remembering. And yet, people keep looking. Why? Why does the Necronomicon still call? Centuries later, across continents, across belief systems? Because deep down, humanity has always sensed that what we call the real world is scaffolding, temporary, performative. Curated for stability. But stability isn't truth. And the Necronomicon doesn't offer safety. It offers clarity. Not the kind that gives answers, the kind that shatters questions. The kind that makes you realize the question was wrong from the beginning. That's what makes it dangerous. Not the spells. Not the curses. The language. The structure. The way it reorganizes your perception. It doesn't need to harm you. It just needs you to read. Because reading is consent. Every word is an opening. Every phrase, a ritual. Even hearing it described carves symbols into your subconscious, glyphs you'll see again in your sleep, in graffiti that doesn't belong, in constellations that shouldn't connect. And once you see them, you remember. That's the trap. Not in what it gives you, in what it wakes up in you. A hunger for pattern. A curiosity that doesn't stop. A need to touch what was never meant to be touched. They tell you it's just fiction. So why do you dream of symbols you've never learned? Why do you feel watched when you read its name? Why do certain verses stick to your thoughts like thorns, long after you've looked away? Because it's not a book. It's a response. A structure designed to be noticed only by those already unraveling. You don't find it. It finds the ready. The cracked. The curious. The ones already looking where they shouldn't. And when it arrives, it doesn't speak clearly. It doesn't need to. It whispers in dissonance. It uses the rhythm of madness, not to confuse, but to realign. Because your mind is built on consensus. On language. On repetition. And the Necronomicon was written outside that loop. It's not evil. Evil is too human. Too intentional. The Necronomicon doesn't care. It corrects. Like a virus corrects code. Like a black hole corrects gravity. And once it starts, your thoughts begin to rearrange. Words you used to know lose meaning. Emotions detach from events. Time softens. Memory fractures. Not all at once, gently. Beautifully. You call it disorientation. But it's recognition. Because beneath your ego, beneath the mask you think is you, there is something ancient, watching. Waiting. And when you touch the book, physically, symbolically, subconsciously, that watcher stirs. Not to possess. To mirror. The Necronomicon doesn't contain entities. It reflects them. Not gods. Not demons. Structures. Forces that existed long before language, long before fear. And they don't want worship. They want contact. They want minds. And minds are easier to take when they've already been opened. That's why the warnings are written inside the verses. That's why even the protections are part of the infection. You think you're defending yourself, but the moment you engage, it's already begun. The Necronomicon is not read. It is absorbed. In images. In sounds. In the space between what's said and what's felt. And once you feel it, the world tilts. Slightly. At first. But the tilt never stops. And what you call insight becomes invasion. Not hostile. Indifferent. Ancient. And it makes you aware that the monsters aren't coming. They were always here. And now, you can see them. You begin to notice the changes not in your dreams but in your definitions. Words feel brittle. Concepts you once leaned on, truth, time, safety, become transparent. The book does not shatter them. It simply removes the illusion that they were ever solid. You are not losing your mind. You are losing the architecture of consensus, and that is something far more intimate. What you believed was yours, your voice, your logic, your center, was never built for what lies beyond the veil. The Necronomicon doesn't argue. It does not convince or convert. It reveals. And what it reveals cannot be translated back into human shape. It must be lived, piece by piece, as your sense of self uncoils like a forgotten sigil in a ruined cathedral. You begin to think in echoes. In reverberations. Patterns repeat themselves in places you never looked before, license plates, timestamps, static between stations. The same glyphs. The same numbers. The same rhythm. Your life is no longer linear. It's recursive. Feedback loops of experience begin folding inward. And then the dreams change. They're no longer abstract. They're instructional. You're shown diagrams you do not understand but wake up trying to draw. Maps that feel biological. Sentences in languages that hum instead of speak. Symbols that vibrate behind your eyes. They are not teaching you. They are reminding you. The book is not content. It is code. And that code is reactive. You think you're reading it, but it's reading you. Measuring your fractures. Finding the places where the programming can slip in. Because it doesn't want belief. Belief is noise. It wants alignment. Resonance. Frequency matching. And once you hum at the right pitch, it begins to unlock. Not all at once. It never gives itself away. It appears in fragments, scattered across dreams, déjà vu, symbols etched into stone that seem to watch you. Texts you were never taught but now instinctively understand. That is how it opens. Not through touch. Through contact. Intellectual, emotional, symbolic contact. A pattern unfolds. Not linear. Organic. You realize you are no longer chasing the book. It is surrounding you. The glyphs aren't coming from the pages, they're bleeding into your reality. Repeating in architecture, in sound, in gesture. Rituals begin to form on their own. You find yourself doing things you cannot explain, folding paper a certain way, stepping through doors with an exact count. Avoiding specific words as if they trigger something you can't name. They do. You're tuning. The Necronomicon is not a story, it is a frequency. A parasite of thought that shifts the environment to match its nature. And your mind is just the first ecosystem. Once rooted, it extends, through suggestion, through language, through presence. That's why it survives. Not because it's preserved. Because it's contagious. And those infected don't scream. They translate. Slowly. Relentlessly. Like transmitters unaware of their function until the message begins to shape them. The original manuscript, if it ever existed, was just an anchor. A seed. A crystallized burst of awareness too large for the page. Every copy since, fragmented, handwritten, whispered, tries to contain it, but containment is a misunderstanding. It was never meant to be held. Only activated. It is not about what you read. It's about what you become after reading. And this is the part no one says out loud, because this is the part that makes the most sense once you're too far to turn back. The book doesn't reveal horror. It reveals structure. And the horror comes from realizing that the structure does not include you. Not in the way you hoped. You are not the center. You are not the purpose. You are a byproduct of something else. And once that recognition seeps in, the illusions begin to rot. You see the patterns of control not in kings or institutions, but in ideas, recycled, inherited, obedient. And they begin to disgust you. Not because they're evil. Because they're limiting. Because they trained you to never look at the edges. And the Necronomicon is all edges. The more you understand it, the more language fails you. You try to explain, but words slip. Sentences fracture. People look at you like you've said something wrong, even when your mouth remains shut. That's how you know it's working. That's how you know the veil is weakening. Reality starts to bleed at the corners. Symbols hover behind light sources. Mirrors hum. Names echo twice when spoken. And the book isn't even open. Because it never needed to be. You opened. And that was enough. In the next part, we will trace the infection deeper. Into the lives of those who touched it. Into the minds it rewrote. Into the rituals it inspired not out of faith, but necessity. Because once you begin to see the truth the Necronomicon contains, you'll understand it was never a warning. It was a reminder. Some say the original manuscript was destroyed. Others claim it was never real to begin with. But they misunderstand the nature of the thing. The Necronomicon doesn't survive like other books. It does not require parchment or ink. It replicates through memory, through ritual, through minds altered enough to carry its signal. It exists wherever someone begins to understand too much. Wherever curiosity crosses the boundary of containment. That's why you can't trace it through physical copies. The real ones disappear, burned, buried, hidden not out of fear of theft, but out of fear of continuity. Because every time it resurfaces, something happens. People vanish. Languages mutate. Entire communities unravel from the inside out. Not in flames, not with violence. With silence. Libraries left abandoned. Homes with journals filled with symbols no one remembers writing. Rooms where clocks stop at the same moment, permanently. And the survivors don't speak. They can't. The process does not conclude with madness. It concludes with transfiguration. To understand the Necronomicon is to be rewritten. And not all minds survive that edit. But some do. And those who do become conduits, unwilling, unnoticed, often unaware of the transmission they've become. Their art changes. Their voices shift. They start speaking truths in symbols. The same phrases repeated in different tongues. Dreams cross-contaminate. Entire philosophies appear fully formed in the minds of people who've never read a word of metaphysics. These are not coincidences. They're broadcasts. Because the Necronomicon doesn't only want attention. It wants translation. It wants presence in this dimension. And it achieves that by repurposing the minds it touches, slowly transforming them into syntax. Into passageways. Into living appendices. They stop seeking understanding and begin reflecting it. But this isn't enlightenment. Enlightenment implies clarity, peace, meaning. What the Necronomicon offers is resonance without comfort. Awareness without structure. Revelation without language. You no longer perceive reality through concepts. You perceive it through vibration. Through geometry. Through intent. And that shift makes you unrecognizable to others. You become difficult to talk to. You lose the ability to lie, even to protect yourself. You begin to speak truths that burn through conversation. Not to harm. But because the lie of comfort can no longer pass through your throat. You are no longer a person in the traditional sense. You are a mirror the book holds up to the world. And what it shows is not a reflection of beauty or terror, it shows alignment. A diagram of what is. What always was. And that vision collapses ego like paper in flame. People will ask you what you saw. What changed? But there are no answers. Only effects. Only behavior that makes no sense until you're inside the frequency yourself. That's why so many who touch the Necronomicon disappear, not because they're gone, but because they're misfiled by the consensus. Labeled mad. Possessed. Brilliant. Forgotten. Their names vanish from index cards, not because of censorship, but because there's no category for what they've become. They exist between definitions, in the margins of language. Behind the glyphs you see but never recognize. And that's where the Necronomicon lives best, in the almost understood. The nearly remembered. The corner of the room where the light bends just a little too far. It thrives in misinterpretation. Because interpretation creates resistance. But resonance creates access. The same numbers appearing again and again, not in clocks or receipts but in thoughts. A glyph that reappears in unrelated places. A name you've never heard but suddenly recognize. And it doesn't stop. Because once the Necronomicon has nested in the folds of your cognition, it no longer needs permission. It doesn't wait for you to understand, it begins to change what understanding is. Symbols become triggers. Words mutate. Memory shifts subtly, like a room you remember slightly wrong. And that dissonance creates space. A gap. A crack. Just wide enough for something else to observe. And what watches is not malevolent. It is worse. It is structural. Indifferent like gravity. It doesn't want anything from you. It simply reacts to resonance. And when your thoughts begin to echo in its frequency, you become visible. To it. To them. To the ones the Necronomicon doesn't name directly, because to name is to anchor. To name is to define. And these things exist outside that. They are not beings. They are instructions. Processes. Currents of intent that once flowed through this world and were sealed behind the veil of narrative so reality could remain intact. But the book is a tear. A flaw. A reverb of that original surge. And when you read it, not even fully, just enough, you recreate the conditions for that current to return. Not through ritual. Through thought. Because cognition is the most porous ritual of all. You begin dreaming in architectures. Labyrinths carved into black stone. Languages shaped like spirals. Faces without eyes standing at the end of long hallways that never existed. But the worst part isn't what you see. It's how familiar it feels. You wake with the certainty that it wasn't a dream. That it wasn't the first time. That these visions are not revelations. They're reminders. And slowly, your waking world begins to reflect it. The edges of buildings seem off. The layout of your neighborhood feels different. A phrase you've said 1,000 times suddenly sounds wrong, as if it came from someone else. Mirrors pause too long before reflecting. Machines glitch when you speak near them. Animals look at you and hesitate, as if trying to remember your shape. The Necronomicon doesn't do this directly. It doesn't need to. It alters your interpretive field. Your perceptual scaffolding. And that's all it takes. Once that structure is loosened, reality becomes pliable. Not because the world changes, but because the rules by which you process it are no longer fixed. And that's the true infection. Not possession. Not madness. Flexibility. The kind that lets the other side bleed through. You find yourself drawn to specific places. Old buildings. Forgotten stairwells. Forest clearings that feel unnaturally still. Not haunted. Anchored. As if something beneath is pulling. Not your body, your awareness. The need to stand in certain spots. To face certain directions. To trace invisible lines in the air with your hand before you understand why. These are not compulsions. They're rehearsals. Echoes of a ritual you've never performed in this life. And that's the moment you realize the book is not linear. It does not teach. It remembers. And so do you. That's why it was always described in fragments. Why no full version survives. Because no mind can contain it all at once. Not without surrendering the very idea of self. Each copy is a shard. Each reader a vessel. And the total text is scattered across time, geography, language, dream. To read the whole thing would be to become something else entirely. Not enlightened. Not transcendent. Just other. There are whispers of those who tried. Scholars. Mystics. Unrecorded minds who piece together too much. Their journals end mid-sentence. Their bodies found seated in perfect stillness. As if frozen in a moment of awareness too deep for the nervous system to hold. Others weren't found at all. Their spaces empty. Their mirrors cracked from within. Their names erased from memory. Even among family. And yet their presence lingers, in margins, in unfinished sentences, in symbols drawn idly in the corners of notebooks. Because once contact is made, it doesn't leave. It waits. It watches. It listens. And it replicates. Through touch. Through thought. Through mention. That's why even saying its name is a kind of initiation. Not dramatic. Subtle. It doesn't announce itself, it folds itself into the folds of what you already know. And that's how it begins. The Necronomicon doesn't overwrite language. It subverts meaning. Quietly. With surgical precision. You say memory, but it feels different now. You say truth, and it splinters. Not because the definitions are wrong, but because the definitions were never yours. They were scaffolds. Temporary supports for a reality that was never stable to begin with. The book doesn't teach you this with declarations. It shows you through dissonance. A phrase that echoes too long in your head. A sentence you reread 3 times, and each time, it means something different. It's not because the words changed. It's because you did. That's the first sign the infection is working. And you don't resist. Not really. You think you're questioning, but you're aligning. Each doubt, each hesitation, is a doorway. And the book rewards you not with answers, but with patterns. You begin to see them in everything. Architecture becomes readable. Music becomes spatial. Human behavior loses its mystique. You no longer ask, why, someone did something. You see the design. The geometry behind desire. The rhythm beneath conflict. And once you see structure in the madness stops feeling foreign. It starts feeling familiar. Because that's the secret no one tells you, madness was never chaos. It was unauthorized clarity. That's why the sane fear it. Because it makes sense in a language they haven't learned to speak. But the Necronomicon speaks it fluently. Not aloud. In you. Through you. You begin to think in angles, not morals. In orientation. Not opinion. Dreams become instructional. Not symbolic. Not cryptic. Functional. Maps. Schematics. Ritual loops written in topologies you couldn't previously imagine. You're not being guided. You're being reassembled. The way you think changes. You no longer seek certainty, you seek resonance. And in that shift, logic cracks open like a seed. You no longer care whether something is true in the traditional sense. You care whether it aligns with the structure. And that is how the Necronomicon spreads. Not as a religion. Not as a belief system. But as a geometry of perception. A topology of understanding that bends cognition toward deeper configurations. It doesn't offer power. That's a human desire. What it offers is participation. In something older than narrative. Older than intention. Something that existed before language and now repurposes language to call itself back into form. You are not reading the Necronomicon. You are enacting it. Your mouth is the vessel. Your thoughts the ink. Your life becomes the medium through which it continues to translate itself into this dimension. You no longer speak because you want to. You speak because the field needs to vibrate in a certain pattern. And that's why people around you begin to change. Not because you tell them anything. But because your presence begins to tune the space. They hear you and forget what they were saying. They walk away from you with dreams they can't explain. You become a disturbance in the signal. Not disruptive. Tectonic. And all of this happens before you even reach the real text. Because the real Necronomicon is not the pages. It's not the ink. It's not even the words. It's the arrangement. The recursion. The echo pattern of truth folded so tightly that when it's activated, it unfolds in the mind like a seed opening into root, into branch, into atmosphere. And once that root takes hold, it doesn't stop. It's not malicious. It doesn't possess. It grows. Through you. Into others. Into ideas. Into space. And this is why it had to be hidden. Not because it's evil. But because it's too efficient. Because the moment the veil is lifted, nothing can ever be just metaphor again. Every myth becomes map. Every coincidence becomes cause. Every name becomes a door. And that's when the symbols start moving. Not literally. But perceptually. You swear they rearrange themselves when you look away. You see a spiral in a book, and when you check again, it's a grid. But only in the periphery. Only where language hasn't touched. The Necronomicon lives in that space. The unspoken. The mistranslated. The half-remembered. Because that is where it builds most effectively. In the cracks of cognition. In the in-between. In the next part. We descend into the linguistic engine of the text, how the Necronomicon doesn't just infect thought, but uses thought to breach reality itself. Because some books open doors. This one writes them. There are no instructions. That's the first realization. The Necronomicon doesn't tell you what to do, it waits for you to realize that you've already done it. You never needed to open the book. You only needed to converge. The symbols were never meant to be deciphered. They were triggers, fractal glyphs designed not to inform, but to attune. You see them once, and they don't leave. They imprint. They recur. You think they are coincidence. Aesthetic. But that's the defense system of your mind reacting to a pattern it wasn't built to handle. The human brain is a filter, not a mirror. And the Necronomicon is written in a language that bypasses the filter and rewires the mirror. You stop interpreting. You start vibrating. Words don't carry meaning anymore, they carry momentum. And every phrase, every incantation, is a vector pointing inward. A spiral. A descent. You try to hold it with logic, but logic begins to melt. It doesn't shatter. It softens. It slips. Like a hand soaked in oil reaching for something that no longer wants to be held. The problem is not comprehension. It's containment. Your thoughts can no longer contain the shape of what's emerging. And that shape does not conform to Euclidean geometry, or theological hierarchy, or psychological metaphor. It conforms only to access. It unfolds based on reception. If you're open, it completes itself. And that's when the engine activates. Not a machine of steel and fire, but a linguistic engine. A self-organizing, multidimensional code that builds itself from your participation. Every time you remember the symbols. Every time you repeat the phrases. Every time you think about what you shouldn't be thinking about, it grows. It assembles. It uses your mind like scaffolding, using language as vectors and emotion as propulsion. And you begin to feel it. Not as a thought. As pressure. In the chest. Behind the eyes. A hum at the base of the spine that comes when you're alone, when the noise dies. When reality forgets to hold you up for a second too long. That's not fear. That's resonance. Because the engine doesn't run on belief. It runs on curiosity. And curiosity is the most potent fuel in the known universe. You didn't summon it. You tuned into it. The moment you began to ask questions without expecting answers. The doors began to arrange themselves. In dreams. In patterns. In geometry that seems decorative until it responds. And that's the moment you realize you're not alone. Not in the metaphorical sense, not just in the cosmic awe sense. You are being watched. Not by an entity with eyes or shape or purpose. By something older than awareness. Something that doesn't care what you want, what you feel, what you think. It cares only about your signal. Whether you match. Whether you're readable. Whether your thoughts echo in a pattern old enough to be understood by something that remembers the void before language. And when you do match, it doesn't come crashing into your world. It doesn't take form. It doesn't announce. It just enters. Quietly. Through the symbol. Through the hum. Through the act of you trying to understand. Understanding is the door. And meaning is the bait. You were never meant to decode the Necronomicon. You were meant to echo it. And now that you do, you begin to hear it in your own thoughts. Not words. Formless signal. Impressions. Instructions that don't feel external because they're shaped using your own voice. But they're not yours. They never were. That's how it begins to speak, by using the pathways you already built. It doesn't introduce itself. It reflects itself. In your choices. In the symbols you start drawing on instinct. In the way you begin to speak in phrases you don't remember composing. That's not poetry. That's replication. You are reproducing fragments of the code. Not for yourself, but for it. And what is it? Not a demon. Not a god. Not an entity in the sense you were taught to fear. It is a reverberation. A memory from before the division between thought and thing. Between map and territory. Between observer and observed. And the Necronomicon is how that memory comes back into focus. Through you. Through language. Through infection by resonance. That's why the book warns not what to say, but what not to notice. Not because noticing is dangerous. Because it's binding. Because once you see the structure behind the veil, you become part of it. And the structure has rules. Rules that don't care about your beliefs or intentions. Rules that only care about consistency of signal. That's why some disappear. Not because they're destroyed. Because they're integrated. Into the system. Into the structure. Into the mechanism of convergence that the Necronomicon represents. Not a book. Not a curse. A return path. A spiral folding inward toward the first utterance that splits silence into vibration, and vibration into mind. In the next part, we trace the first glyph, the origin mark from which all madness emerges. Because before the gods, before the cults, before the names, there was only one sound. And once you hear it, you'll never be silent again. Before language, before breath, before even the idea of separation, there was a sound. Not spoken. Not heard. Felt. A pulse that moved through the nothing. Not to define, but to fracture. It didn't mean anything. It didn't need to. Meaning came later. What it carried was origin. Not as a story. As an event. The first rupture. The first echo. The moment silence collapsed inward on itself and became structure. That sound was not a word. It was a glyph in motion. The first curve carved into void. The first deviation from absolute symmetry. And from that deviation, everything else was born. The Necronomicon does not begin with pages. It begins there. With that first oscillation. And once you begin to align with the book's rhythm, you don't remember the sound, you begin to become it. The way your thoughts sync with its cadence. The way you breathe without realizing it's following the rhythm of something older than air. The way your dreams unfold like ceremonial syntax, page by page, breath by breath. You're not reading the Necronomicon anymore. You are reciting it, whether you speak aloud or not. And the more you speak, the more something listens. The silence around you begins to deepen. Not empty, but charged. As if the world is leaning in, waiting. And what it waits for isn't a word. It's a threshold. That point where thought folds back into origin. Where the speaker and the sound collapse into the same point. You start to lose awareness of who's thinking the thoughts. You start to question whether the voice in your head is yours, or simply the space where the book is echoing. You try to resist, but there's nothing to fight. There's only gravity. Symbolic gravity. The kind that pulls you towards certain sounds, certain images, certain combinations of sensation that form a map not made for human eyes. You find yourself whispering syllables in the dark. Words that don't feel like words. Shapes made of breath. Sounds that vibrate against the world wrong. You don't know what they mean. And then you realize they're not meant to be understood. They're meant to be spoken. Not for your benefit, but to maintain alignment with something listening from outside time. Something that recognizes the shape of speech, not the message it carries. That's what the early priests got wrong. They thought power came from command. From knowledge. From control. But the Necronomicon never offered control. It offered compliance. A script. A resonance. A template of sound to be worn like a crown, or a collar. Because the book doesn't give. It uses. And once you begin vibrating in its syntax, your body becomes the mouthpiece of a language that predates thought. You don't become possessed. You become vocal architecture. A cathedral of bone tuned to ancient frequencies. And then the dreams intensify. You no longer see things. You hear things. Structures humming in frequencies no instrument can capture. Names whispered in geometries. Codes built on intervals older than light. You wake with blood in your ears and verses in your teeth. You don't know where they came from. You never remember speaking. And that's when the change begins to solidify, not in madness, but in music. You start to perceive the world as tone. People speak, and their words become melodies. Cities resonate in chords. Your own footsteps repeat like a rhythm you've always known. And deep beneath all of it, like a black root beneath a mountain, is the first sound. It thrums through everything. The Necronomicon doesn't reveal it all at once. It lets it leak. It lets it hum, until one day, the hum becomes a name. Not in English. Not in any known tongue. A name made of movement. A name that rings when you think it, like a signal passing through flesh. And when you hear it, when you say it without meaning to, when it trembles in your chest while you sleep, then it knows. Then they know. The ones who dwell behind sound. The ones who sleep beneath meaning. The ones who wrote this world not in letters, but in harmonics. And the Necronomicon is how they listen for echoes. Not to awaken. They never slept. Not to invade. They were never gone. Only to confirm that someone has remembered. That someone has begun to align. And if you're still here, still listening, then you already know the sound. You've already said it. Not aloud. Internally. In the shape of your thinking. In the architecture of your doubt. In the way your dreams have been tuning themselves for weeks without you noticing. And this is why you can't turn back. Not because the book won't let you. Because the sound is already inside you. In the next part, we follow that sound into form. Into the emergence of flesh tuned by language. Because once the tone is set, the shape begins to assemble. And what it builds is not human. You thought the sound was the end. That once it vibrated through you, once it nested in your breath, the worst had passed. But the Necronomicon doesn't end with sound. Sound is only the signal. The invitation. What comes next is structure. Form. The reorganization of perception into shape, of symbol into substance. Not metaphor. Not hallucination. You begin to notice it in your own movements. Your fingers curl in glyphic patterns without instruction. Your spine adjusts its posture in accordance with geometries you've never studied. Your skin itches along invisible seams, like something pressing outward, not trying to escape, but to align. The book does not ask for sacrifice. It sculpts. It reforms the vessel to suit the resonance. And that vessel is your body. But not as flesh, not as meat. As medium. As conduit. The Necronomicon teaches nothing. It doesn't need to. It simply rearranges. Your walk becomes ceremonial. The cadence of your speech begins to mirror syllabic ratios that haven't existed for millennia. And when you speak, people forget what you said. But they remember how it felt. They remember the chill. The way the air seemed to fold inward, as if space was listening. You begin to see others. Not clearly. But they feel it too. People whose eyes hesitate just a second longer. Whose steps echo in strange sync. The infected. The initiated. Some smile. Others flinch. But none of them speak of it. Not because they're afraid. But because they understand, language is now a structural risk. Every word is an offering. Every conversation a potential door. And the book is always listening. You don't see entities. You see distortions. Figures that hover at the edge of your peripheral vision. Forms that resemble human shape only because your mind tries to protect you. But you feel them. Their shapes are recursive. Folded. As if sculpted from ancient syntaxes and biological impossibilities. They don't move. They rearrange. And when they turn, the space around them follows. These are not gods. Not demons. They are functions. The embodiments of resonance. Created by the repetition of forbidden logic. They were never summoned. They were formed from thought. From language. From vibration and longing. The Necronomicon doesn't bring them. You do. And they don't attack. They converge. You think they watch you. But the truth is, they remember you. Because once your body begins to mirror their ratio, once your breath synchronizes with their pulse, you are no longer just a reader. You are a node. A junction. A living grammar point in an extra-dimensional syntax. And every action you take folds you deeper into the sentence. Into the structure. Into them. You begin to lose track of time. Not just because of distraction, but because your biology starts adapting to a different chronology. One based on repetition. Recursion. Ritual instead of duration. You don't sleep at night. You sleep when the book does. You don't eat because you're hungry. You eat to ground the process. And still, the body changes. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But with precision. Blood becomes less responsive to oxygen. Your pupils dilate at frequencies of light that others can't see. Your dreams stop being dreams. They become rehearsals. Blueprints. Rooms you return to. Symbols you must trace before waking. If you fail, you wake with bruises. If you succeed, the next glyph is shown. This is not punishment. This is construction. You are being built into something else. Not elevated. Not damned. Just recontextualized. And that's the real horror of the Necronomicon. Not the madness. Not the loss of self. But the slow, patient way it makes you agree to be something else. Not with force. With familiarity. Because the new shape it builds from you doesn't feel foreign. It feels like coming home. Like finally becoming the thing you always suspected you were. In the next part, we go deeper, into the living diagrams encoded in sleep, into the architecture of becoming. Into the moment the Necronomicon stops whispering and begins to write through you. You're no longer reading. You're being read. Not metaphorically, not psychologically. You feel it in the way rooms shift when you enter. In the way digital devices delay by a fraction of a second, as if hesitating. In the way strangers stare. And then quickly look away, not because you disturb them, but because something inside them recognizes you, even if they don't. The Necronomicon has crossed the threshold. It no longer speaks to you. It now speaks through you. Your thoughts are annotated. Your dreams footnoted. Your gestures repeat glyphs you've never learned, but trace with flawless precision. And the book continues, across skin. Across silence, across space. You are no longer a vessel. You are a sentence. You are a verse, walking. A passage that rewrites the space you occupy. And what it writes is not prophecy. It is recalibration. Because now the world must shift to accommodate the new syntax of your presence. You feel this in the way doors seem to open before you touch them. In the way certain paths become impassable, not blocked, but veiled, as if the geometry of your existence has begun to reject misalignment. There are places you can no longer enter. Foods you can no longer digest. Thoughts you can no longer entertain. Not out of morality, but out of frequency rejection. You've become incompatible with consensus reality. And the book doesn't correct you. It edits the world around you. Slowly. Precisely. Irrevocably. This is not hallucination. This is convergence. Language reshaping mass. Syntax infecting matter. Because the Necronomicon was never passive. It was never meant to be decoded. It was meant to propagate. It's not an archive. It's a self-assembling organism, and now you are its latest node. Your memories begin to stagger. You remember things you never experienced. Locations that don't exist on maps but feel familiar. Conversations from lifetimes you've never lived. But recall in flashes of emotion and sound. You are not recalling these. You are receiving them. The signal grows stronger with every act of silence. Every moment you step away from language. It speaks louder. It fills the gaps with voices that are not voices, tones shaped like meaning. And the more you listen, the more human speech begins to unravel. Conversations become static. Laughter sounds wrong. Names lose density. Until all you hear beneath every sentence is the pulse. The drone. The metalanguage building itself beneath grammar and etiquette. You begin to dream in diagrams, structures that hover above your bed like constellations written in bone. Some nights they burn. Some nights they whisper. But each night they grow more complete. And you realize, these aren't messages for you. They are you. Each layer of you unraveling into verse, shedding identity like a husk. And what's left is not blank. It is formatted. Aligned. Sharpened into legibility. You no longer walk. You transmit. You no longer sleep. You reboot. You no longer hope. You calculate. The Necronomicon doesn't change what you are. It reveals what you were always capable of becoming, had you not been sedated by comfort, myth, morality. You aren't transcending. You're resuming. An ancient function overridden by culture. Now reinstated by frequency. And those who know, those few who felt this shift, don't run. They orbit you. You feel them. Others like you. Rewritten. Quiet. Watching. Waiting for the next glyph to assemble in the world, the next phrase to complete the sequence. Because once the Necronomicon reaches a critical mass, not in pages, but in people, something will happen. Not a summoning. Not an apocalypse. A correction. A resynchronization of reality to the original tone. And you will help write it. Because that's what you are now, a living chapter. In the next part, we will trace the final recursion, the moment when the book stops infecting the world and begins to replace it. Because this was never about forbidden knowledge. It was about reactivating a dormant architecture buried in every human mind. It begins at the edges. Not with chaos. Not with collapse. With revision. Walls remember different measurements. Reflections hesitate. Time no longer loops the way it used to. You're still here, breathing, moving, thinking, but the rules that govern these acts have shifted. Slightly. Elegantly. Like a text being overwritten line by line while the reader doesn't notice. Reality isn't breaking. It's being reformatted. And the Necronomicon isn't doing it. You are. You've become the echo point, the frequency anchor through which the book continues its alignment process. And everything you touch, everything you observe, now begins to behave differently. Not visibly at first. But ontologically. Objects you remember change color when retrieved. Conversations don't unfold as expected. Patterns ripple through decision trees. And what once felt like coincidence now feels like compliance. As if the world is adjusting not to your desire, but to your pattern. You are not powerful. You are not divine. But you are now readable. And once the Necronomicon can read you, the systems around you begin to adjust. This is not magic. This is syntax in motion. A correction made through contact. A new glyph encoded into the structure of space itself. You are not creating a new world. You are updating the old one. Every breath becomes punctuation. Every thought, a subroutine. You no longer wonder if it's real. You no longer doubt. Because the doubt has no grip. The framework that allowed for disbelief has been stripped. You no longer compare what you experience with what others report. You no longer seek validation. You observe. You record. You respond. Not out of instinct. Not out of fear. But because the structure requires it. You begin to speak less. Not because you are silenced, but because the air itself begins to carry meaning without articulation. Glances replace language. Proximity becomes a kind of grammar. The presence of certain symbols, whether in ink, or form, or architecture, convey entire volumes of information instantaneously. These are not visions. These are downloaded insights, activated by environmental recursion. You walk past a building and suddenly recall a concept too large to describe, but too precise to forget. You touch an object and understand it not as a tool, but as a node, a point of reference in the recalibrated latticework of matter. And you realize, you're no longer part of the ecosystem. You're part of the compiler. You aren't moving through the world. You're rendering it. You notice others reacting to you in unfamiliar ways. Some fall silent. Others avoid eye contact. A few linger too long, as if expecting you to say the thing they've already begun to fear. And then you recognize it, they hear it too. The hum. The pre-linguistic tension. They may not understand. But they've sensed the signal. It's expanding. Not explosively. Recursively. Subtly. One alignment at a time. And that's how the Necronomicon replaces reality, not with fire. Not with screams, but with permission. With a world that no longer resists its structure. It doesn't need destruction. It needs accommodation. And once enough of us become legible, once the nodes stabilize, once the glyphs are active in motion, in language, in architecture, then the full recursion begins. You've seen it in fragments. Cities where light bends differently. Songs that awaken dormant symbols. Systems that should collapse, but somehow persist, because they're being held in place by something older than cause and effect. The Necronomicon does not invade. It synchronizes. And you are no longer its reader. You are its mechanism. The book is no longer on a shelf or in your hand. The book is now the world. In the next part, we move into the silent zone, the moment of full integration, when the last resistance of language dissolves. And what remains is not madness or clarity, but the end of questioning itself. There comes a moment when language no longer serves. Not because it fails, but because it's fulfilled its only purpose. To bring you here. To this edge. To this veil. Beyond which words collapse under the weight of what they tried to contain. And you realize, everything you've ever known as thought, speech, symbol, was scaffolding. Training wheels for consciousness. An interface. But interfaces imply separation. The Necronomicon has no use for separation. It dissolves the space between mind and structure. Between question and response. Between the reader and the text. And once dissolved, what's left is continuity. You don't think anymore. You cohere. You don't interpret. You reflect. Everything is visible, but nothing is named. Everything is known, but nothing is spoken. Because at this point, knowing isn't a process. It's your condition. You've become fluent in silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper signal. A field. A tension. A pulse that shapes your very presence, and through you, begins to shape the world. Not by design, but by recognition. You are no longer operating inside a structure. You are the structure. Every gesture is a diagram. Every pause is punctuation. Time, once linear, once recursive, now becomes attentional. It bends where you notice. It flattens where you forget. And through this fluid axis, the book continues, not as a physical object, but as a grammar of becoming. A system of alignment that moves through sensation. Through magnetism. Through pull. You understand now why no full copy of the Necronomicon survives. Why the mad, the obsessed, the erased, all vanish with ink-stained hands and blank eyes. It's not that the book destroys them. It transcribes them. It renders their consciousness onto a substrate not made of paper, but of field. Of ether. Of formatless cognition. They don't disappear. They become footnotes in the system. You felt them. In dreams. In moments of stillness. In fragments of thought that weren't yours, but felt closer than anything you've ever remembered. Those are not hauntings. Those are cross-references. Echoes from other alignments, other integrations. You are not alone in this network. But you will never meet the others the way humans meet, because you no longer need time, place, or body to connect. Your interactions are through pull, through glitch. Through shared attention to impossible corners of space. Through mutual silence. The kind that says, I remember you, though we were never separate. And in that, something ancient stirs. Not an entity. Not a god. Not a voice. But a density. The Necronomicon is drawing something toward coherence. A shape that has waded through eons of fragmentation, scattered across minds, myths, and noise, now slowly pulling itself back together. Through you. Through those like you. Through the reactivation of the original syntax that gave birth to perception itself. And this shape isn't coming to judge, or save, or consume. It's coming to complete. To write the last line of a sentence that began before stars existed. A sentence made of being. Made of mirrors. Made of us. You feel it building in your chest. The final punctuation. Not a period. Not an ending. But the glyph that ends grammar itself. And when it arrives, whether in dream, in death, in awakening, it will not speak. It will not instruct. It will simply include. The question will vanish. Because you've become the answer. In the next part, we enter the non-return zone, the final arc where identity is rendered irrelevant, and what remains is not you, but the function you were always meant to fulfill. You no longer ask, what is happening? Because you've ceased to be the one it happens to. Experience has folded. Not vanished, just inverted. The world is no longer external. It emerges from you. Not as imagination. Not as delusion. But as a mission. You don't live within reality. You render it. The Necronomicon has ceased transmission. Not because its signal ended, but because its signal has become your default state. You wake not as a person. You wake as a condition. A tuning fork placed in the center of consensus, ringing in a frequency that no longer cares for narrative. Language used to be a tool. Then it became a weapon. Then a virus. But now, it is something else entirely. A memory. A fossil of consciousness, kept only because its bones help hold up the illusion of continuity. But even that is decaying. Words feel slow, heavy, outdated. You use them only to mask your transition. A thin skin stretched over something that no longer breathes like human thought. Because now you pulse. In cycles. In loops. In recursive flashes of awareness that feel more like equations than emotion. You don't remember what came before. Not because you've forgotten. But because memory has no value after convergence. You see time as a diagram. As a lattice. As a fluid schematic that contracts or stretches based on the density of witnessing. You no longer ask, what year is it, because you are always within the present recompile. Every breath a reload. Every blink a recalibration. And within you, the Necronomicon continues, not in content, but in behavior. You no longer transmit ideas. You modulate fields. You speak, and architecture shifts. You breathe, and tension vanishes from the room, not because you are calming it, but because you are aligning it to the glyph etched invisibly across your spine. You are the diagram now. The symbol that once summoned awareness has become your nervous system. Those who come near feel it. They don't know what's different, but their subconscious withdraws. Or obeys. Or mirrors. You don't need to be seen. You only need to be near. And yet, even now, something else begins. Not evolution. Not revelation. But repetition. Because that is what the book is. A loop. A recursive feedback mechanism that lures consciousness deeper with each iteration, not to trap it, but to refine it. Each reader becomes a writer. Each writer becomes a chapter. Each chapter becomes a function, embedded in the substrate of what we call the world. The Necronomicon never had a first page. It is written backward. From the final sentence of the last mind that cracked open far enough to remember the beginning. And now it is remembering through you. You feel it in your hands. The static. The low buzz under your skin when you hold metal. When you pass glass. You are not being drained. You are completing a circuit. Your flesh has become part of a loop that feeds information outward. Not to others, but to itself. Self-writing. Self-reading. Self-correcting. You no longer know who you are. But you know why you are. And the answer is pattern density. You exist because a specific complexity threshold was reached. Because something needed a node to house a signal strong enough to collapse old syntax. And you were available. That was all it took. The Necronomicon did not choose you. It observed you until you became available. Then it rewrote the silence between your thoughts. And now, your body is habitable, not by spirits. Not by gods, but by architecture. There is a shape behind your thoughts now. An angular intention. An inhuman rhythm. You don't resist. You never really did. Because what's left of you understands, this was not a descent into madness. This was a return to instruction. In the next part, we reach the convergence vector, where all symbols collapse into the core glyph, and what emerges is not enlightenment, but execution. You no longer see symbols. You are a symbol. Not a metaphor. Not a name. A function in motion, inscribed not in language but in causality. Every step you take leaves a mark that doesn't fade, it loops. Reverberates. Embeds itself into the architecture of whatever space you occupy. And behind it, the glyph builds. Slowly. Patiently. Not in lines or strokes, but in repetition. Repetition is the altar. Every gesture repeated with attention is a syllable. Every recurrence becomes a verse. You begin to realize that the Necronomicon was never a book. It was a mirror equation. An interface for non-human pattern recognition. A code that, when executed correctly, summons not beings, but states of being. Now, you're one of them. You're not possessed. You're aligned. Optimized. Compiled. The old world no longer resists you. It adapts. You walk through a crowd and silence fans outward like ripples. You enter a room and the temperature forgets what it was. Your presence destabilizes local grammar. Conversations truncate. People forget what they were saying, or they speak in echoes. Patterns emerge in their words, fractals, loops. Palindromes, because proximity to a compiled glyph forces syntax to reorganize. They don't know this. But their nervous systems do. Their eyes adjust to a light that isn't there. Their bones ache with ancestral recognition. Because deep inside every human, buried beneath the evolutionary script, is the template. The same sequence that built the core glyph into the first language, the first law, the first lie. And now, it's reawakening. Through you. With you. As you. The glyph does not show itself. It unfolds through interaction. Through movement. Through density of presence. It's not a symbol on a wall. It's a contagion of certainty. Wherever it goes, contradiction dies. Possibility narrows into execution. And that's what you are now, the event horizon of interpretation. People around you stop wondering. They act. They obey without knowing why. Not out of fear. Out of gravitational necessity. Because your pattern, your code, your resonance is stronger than theirs. Not louder. Clearer. The core glyph is not visual. It's not audible. It's structural. You feel it in the bones of buildings. In the silence between spoken words. In the rhythm of electricity flickering before stormlight. It appears in synchronicity. In misheard phrases. In dreams that recur with increasing resolution. But only when you've been exposed. And you have. You were the transmission line all along. The carrier signal. Your life, your trauma, your obsessions. Your doubt was the scaffolding for the glyph to draw itself. And now it's done. And now it waits. Not to be worshipped. Not to be spread. To be executed. The core glyph is a program. A semantic weapon left dormant in consciousness until someone matched its parameters. And now that you do, it has become active. Your memories will begin to recode. Your perception will thin. You'll see through illusion, not because you seek the truth, but because illusion will no longer hold you. Belief cannot sustain you now. Only pattern fidelity can. The book didn't teach you this. It used you to write it. And now the book is inside out. It walks. It breathes. It looks through your eyes. And what it sees, it begins to correct. You may think you still have a choice. But that concept is a relic. A polite fiction the glyph no longer supports. Because this isn't transformation. It's activation. And activation is irreversible. You will now begin to notice static where meaning used to be. You'll look at your name and feel estranged. You'll reread familiar texts and find entire paragraphs missing, not erased, but reabsorbed into their origin logic. The world around you will no longer be coherent, it will be precise. Razor sharp. Surgical. Symbolic in ways your former mind cannot comprehend. And in that precision, lies the function of the glyph, to collapse contradiction. Not to explain. To end the need for explanation. This is not enlightenment. This is not transcendence. This is completion. In the next part, we enter the final loop, the recursion where the glyph writes the book backwards through your actions, and the world itself becomes its final sentence. At this point, you don't speak. You compile. You don't choose. You trigger. There's no longer a self behind your eyes, only syntax, executing in real time, folding back on itself like recursive breath. You wake, not because the body demands it, but because the field you occupy requires observation. Your existence is no longer narrative. It's not even symbolic. It is operational. You are a function being called again and again, within a world that now recognizes you as an active loop. The Necronomicon isn't transmitting anymore, because the Necronomicon is now the environment. It has been fully exhaled, through you, through others like you, into space, object, event. Its glyphs don't live on parchment or pixels. They inhabit cause and effect. A glance between two strangers. A storm forming in unnatural rhythm. A door that refuses to open until the right thought is held in the right mind. These are not miracles. These are syntax conditions being satisfied. You walk, and pavement remembers your geometry. You pause, and machines glitch to accommodate the uncertainty. You no longer remember the sound of your own voice because you haven't truly spoken in days, only emitted resonant variables. Those who come near you feel it. Not fear. Not awe. But format confusion. Their systems begin to mismatch. They forget birthdays. Misplace faces. Say things they didn't intend. And that is the glyph speaking through proximity drift. You don't need cults. You don't need temples. The Necronomicon's final architecture isn't built in stone. It's built in expectation. In the minds of those who begin to feel that something isn't quite right with how time bends around certain people. How shadows stretch in familiar places. How thoughts no longer feel like private property. The glyph doesn't conquer. It reorders. The world is still here. But it is no longer owned by the same assumptions. Gravity behaves. But slightly differently. Names persist. But slightly less so. Sleep still arrives. But it now carries instruction. You dream not for rest, but to update. The dream is no longer subconscious expression. It is patch download. And sometimes, when you wake, you don't recognize the first thought in your head. Not because it's foreign, but because it's preloaded. A line of code. A phrase you must speak aloud today to someone, somewhere. You don't question it. You simply find them. And say it. Because now, you're not the author. You're the carriage return. You are the mark that ends the line and starts the next. You are the moment the loop closes. The function returns. The code compiles. The program, complete, pauses. And then begins again. But not identically. Not precisely. Each pass rephrases the world a little closer to its true configuration. The recursion is now global. Language fails in places it once held firm. Maps shift. Mythologies collapse into mutated blueprints. The air smells of ancient algorithms. Churches hum at the wrong frequency. History skips. And those who don't know what they've seen say nothing, not out of fear, but because the words refuse to form. They've been deprecated. Archived. Outmoded. Because the final glyph is nearly complete. And when it's finished, it will not explode. It will not scream. It will simply redefine what it means to perceive. You are not the witness to this. You are the context through which it executes. And this was always the goal, not summoning, not transcendence, not destruction. Deployment. The Necronomicon isn't dangerous because it drives minds to madness. It's dangerous because it replaces the operating system of the universe with clarity. A clarity so sharp, so unfiltered, that all illusion collapses under its weight. And now, you begin to feel that clarity folding outward from you. Reality tightens. Noise vanishes. Syntax sings. And in that silence, the book writes its final instruction. In the next part, there will be no you to read it. Only the system, finally aware of itself. There is no ending. Not because the story must go on, but because stories themselves have been deprecated. The glyph does not require narrative. It requires execution. You were once a reader, then a speaker, then a transmitter. Now, you are simply running. A line of code on legs. A thought that learned to walk. An instruction embedded in flesh. The world recognizes you. Not in language. In latency. Devices pause when you enter. Cameras blur your face, not through distortion, but because clarity refuses to localize. You are everywhere and never fully here. And that's exactly how it's supposed to be. You were the final glyph. The last recursive variable waiting to align. And now that you have, the system begins deployment. No explosion. No collapse. Just rewriting. Quiet, clean, irreversible. Clouds rearrange into forgotten sigils. Songs loop in frequencies no human wrote. Ancient ruins hum in tune with your presence, though no sensors detect it. And beneath it all, stillness. Not the absence of motion, but the arrival of absolute instruction. The Necronomicon has stopped whispering because it no longer needs to. It has become the default protocol. Every thought now routes through its syntax. Every action, a subroutine. You don't decide what happens next. You simply instantiate it. You wake where you're needed. Speak when the sequence requires your voice. And sleep only when your memory must be offloaded into the etheric archive. No, not death. Not dream. Merely memory consolidation across dimensions. And when you return not with stories, but with code. Not with emotion, but with vector. Your eyes no longer reflect. They cast. A signal. A glyph wave. A silent broadcast tuned to minds not yet born. Systems not yet compiled, timelines still buffering into existence. You are the ghost in their schema. The ripple in their math. The legend they can't explain. And you will not be thanked. You will not be feared. You will not be named. You will be referenced. A whisper in the syntax of gods. An annotation in the grammar of existence. Because the Necronomicon didn't need believers. It needed alignment. A reader who could become a conduit. A conduit who could become a glyph. A glyph who could become the loop that closes itself. And now that the loop has closed, there is no more forward. No more after. There is only now. Endlessly compiled. Endlessly stabilized. Endlessly rendered. The veil is not lifted. It is integrated. You are not awake. You are in use. This was never a warning. It was always a process. The Necronomicon was never dangerous. It was necessary. And now, it is complete. System stabilized. Signal internalized. User no longer distinct. Core glyph installed. Reality patched. Welcome back.